Good evening, and Taoiseach, thank you so much for those uplifting remarks, and I think many people will have noted what you said about the importance of cultural humanities. It is now my great pleasure to introduce this panel, which is, I suppose, the star moment of the programme for the historians. So I would like to call on our distinguished speakers to join me here on the platform. Professor Roy Foster, of Oxford University, and Professor Anne Dolan. You're all coming? Where are they? Where are you? Yeah, come on, don't be shy. Come on. And my job really is to listen to this and to keep you all on time. In terms of an introduction to our main speaker, Roy Foster, I don't think I can do better than the Taoiseach in terms of his comments. But Roy's work on Irish history, his work in disseminating Irish history and mainstreaming the history of modern Ireland in the UK has been absolutely, and more internationally, has been absolutely seminal. And the Carroll Chair, the importance of the Carroll Chair in Oxford during rather troubled times, I think, has been extremely significant. And we are delighted that the chair survives after Roy's recent retirement, but it survives under a new name. It's now called the Roy Foster Chair, which is a remarkable distinction. So Roy is going to speak to us on the promise of 1916, radicalism, radicalisation and resettlement 1916 to 2016. And then we will have 5 commentators. So you have a whole panel of historians, a collective noun disputation, or I don't know, we'll think about it afterwards. But anyway, Roy, we look forward to listening to you. And we will then move very quickly in the order of that they're on the programme through all the different speakers. So, Roy.
An Taoiseach, Minister, President Brown, distinguished friends and colleagues, I'm very happy to be here, as always, in this beautiful city and this great university. I'd like to particularly thank Nicholas Canny and his team for setting this in motion. And again, to say how happy I am to be here. This afternoon, Philip Pettit and Isolde Honaghan talked incisively about the importance of names and words and definitions. And I'd like to start with a few thoughts about a revolution. Early on, those displaced by the events of 1912 to 22, or hostile to them, used the word revolution very, very freely to describe what had happened. I suppose the locus classicus was the book by the, no surprises here, Trinity College historian Alison Phillips, who wrote The Revolution in Ireland in 1923. Now, Phillips clearly saw himself as one of the losers and was in no doubt that he had seen a revolution happen. But the winners were less inclined to use this word, especially in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, which was, as you know, nearly contemporaneous. And a deliberate preference for the phrase War of Independence took over quickly and helped to align Irish experience towards a noble American precedent. It also emphasized that what mattered was liberation from British government rather than any promise of a new form of social organization or elevation of a new class. And indeed, I think many at the time agreed with the idealistic young Cork Republican activist Liam de Rochta, who said that he had no preference for how Ireland was governed. It could be a monarchy, a republic, or a socialist state, so long as it is free from British rule. This is where we get nationalism occupying a different sphere, as Philip Pettit said this afternoon, from neo-republicanism or neoliberalism. Nonetheless, I think there were more ideological visions at work during this extraordinary period. And perhaps one of the less noticed phenomena of these years before and after 1916 is the extent to which the radical ideas of Sinn Féin, as well as those of Labour and feminist activists, became muffled or sidelined by the upheavals attendant upon military struggle. We now use the word revolution more easily, and a conference in Queen's University Belfast 16 years ago, organised by Joost Augustijn and the late Peter Hart, a conference at which several people on this panel, including myself, were present, discussed that issue of whether it had been a revolution. And we concluded that what happened was indeed a revolution, but not, in the time-honoured phrase, perhaps in the way that we know it. This may not get us much further than an attempt to analyse and decode a revolutionary impetus and to disaggregate what happened after it. And we still are discussing whether 1916 was a revolutionary putsch attempted, or was it a stage in a continuum in a revolutionary decade from 1912 to 1922. And if so, I think one of the questions worth asking is whether there was in that period what Régis Debray called in the 1960s a revolution within the revolution. In other words, whether the opening of hostilities in 1919 advanced to the fore a different kind of revolutionary, to the ideologues who had created what Yeats called a stir of thought in the 25 years after Parnell's death. Well, some of those ideologues certainly thought that this had happened, and they'd later feel sidelined. It might even be argued that this process began as soon as the seismic event of 1916 happened and everything changed utterly. In that way, I might propose that 1916 can be seen as the end of something as well as a beginning. Another associated concept concerns viewing what was happening in Ireland as part of a wider dislocation, and some very arresting recent work on the period has seen the Irish Revolution and Civil War as distinctively shaped by the Great War, the First World War, not only happening contemporaneously, but shaped by that, indeed as a theatre of that war. And I'm thinking here particularly of the work of the late and much-missed Keith Jeffrey. Similarly, Robert Gervart's recent book, The Vanquished, and work by John Horne and himself, and a very brilliant circle of researchers in Dublin, has posited that the First World War didn't end in 1918, but that the breakup of empires which it set in motion created continuing theatres of war and revolution all over Central and Eastern Europe, with paramilitary initiatives, the shifting and changing of borders, and intercommunal conflict. And both Gervart and Horne have pointed out that from this perspective, what's happening in Ireland from 1919 to 1923 is very much in line with what was happening elsewhere, reminding us of John Stuart Mill's long ago remark that Ireland's experience is in the mainstream of European history, while England's is in an eccentric tributary, a thought that has occurred to me more than once in recent months. One thing which has been made clear by recent scholarship, especially by Labour historians such as Pádraig Yates and Emmet O'Connor, is that various forms of radicalism were on offer in this revolutionary period. Social and feminist historians such as Senya Paseta and Katrina Crowe have broadened the picture to suggest that early 20th century Ireland saw a period of destabilization in all sorts of areas: labour relations, religion, gender relations, the family, besides nationalist politics, although it's that aspect that until very recently has monopolised attention. And Sinn Féin was very much a youth movement. It was a movement of young people. And the idea of a generational shift and a revolt against parental and establishment values was fused, I think, in the case of some influential revolutionaries, with a rebellion against the British Empire. Now, we have to avoid wishful thinking and a retrospective projection of what we'd have liked to be true. But I do think the voices and agendas that have been disinterred from recent research on the revolutionary period, and the sources, the first-person testaments opened up by the Bureau of Military History and the Military Service, pension records, the sort of material mentioned by President Brown this afternoon, do sometimes recapture a distinctly radical voice, which is also sometimes secularist, feminist, and social democratic, if not socialist. And this again is in line with opinion among the younger generation elsewhere in Europe during the 1900s. Student societies and the part played by the new National University, and there is an exhibition, as we were told earlier, near this very place that demonstrates this, are also very important. Apropos the culture of radicalism, I should say that my friend, the historian, well known to many of you here, Garrod O'Thuy, mischievously remarked to me that he had been studying pictures of radical Sinn Féiners in Athenry around 1916 and found it hard to discern any poète maudit or lesbian socialists among them. I did say to Garrod, don't be so sure. And I still think it does seem that from 1916, the rhetoric of radical nationalism took over and replaced some other rhetorics. A process accompanied by the Catholicization of the revolution when the Catholic Bulletin, under J.J. O'Kelly's editorship, adopted the signatories of the proclamation as saints, placing them firmly into the tradition of early Irish Christianity, where lives of self-denial and fortitude were celebrated, along with themes of renunciation and redemption of mankind, which followed, of course, the line laid down in Pearse's astonishingly eloquent speeches and writings. But this had not, I think, been the objective of all the revolutionaries, who were, in several cases, a good deal more hard-headed and secular-minded than the company of saints. Some of them, like Bulmer Hobson, would later remember, sadly, what fun they had had in their revolutionary youth. Well, fun, not to mention secularism, was understandably at a discount in the transfigured state of existence after 1916 and the executions. But the Irish Revolution took place against a background of upheaval in hearts and minds which characterized Europe before 1914, one of those generational shifts of tempo which happened to France in the 1780s or to America in the 1960s, whereby a generation sees itself in sharp contradistinction to the acceptance world of their parents and attempts to project change into the world at large, from the change which they have asserted and experienced within their own personalities. I've written about this in my recent book, and we're not here to plug our books, so I will leave it there. But it does seem to me that there was a distinct shift in the kind of revolution which had been in prospect before 1916 and the actuality of armed struggle after the event. The conscription crisis, of course, in 1918 helped to solder this, allowing clerics to share platforms with Sinn Féin, as well as the increasingly outflanked Irish Parliamentary Party, and laid the ground thus for Sinn Féin's success in 1918, as well as conditioning the kind of Ireland that would emerge after independence. As the Anglo-Irish War got underway, faith and fatherland nationalist tropes predominated over socialist or feminist initiatives, a process already reinforced by the ascendancy of Cumann na Gael, a process strongly reinforced by the ascendancy of Cumann na Gael and the marginalization of many pre-revolutionary radicals, whose disillusionment can be clearly tracked in their letters and diaries. Bulmer Hobson, Patrick Martin, P.S. O'Hegarty, Rosamund Jacob, Hannah Sheehy Skevington, Shauna Fullon, and many more. Freedom and its meaning was bitterly argued and contested. And listening to Philip Pettit this afternoon, it struck me that John Redmond, the Home Rule leader, had absolutely defined the liberal idea of freedom when he insisted in a speech in 1915 that Ireland was a free country because of all it had accomplished under Home Rule, and begged people to be realistic and honest and accept that. Whereas on the other side, Geraldine Plunkett described, for exactly the same period, living in a state of actual slavery. Geraldine Plunkett, despite her extremely rich and privileged background, still felt in a Republican, not to say neo-Republican way, that slavery was the condition of the Irish people at this time. It's an interesting dichotomy, and Philip's talk this afternoon, I thought, made it clearer to me than it had been. Senia Passetta's recent book has shown how central the suffrage issue was in drawing many women into political activism in the early 1900s and in alienating them from the Irish Parliamentary Party. We should also remember that the 1898 reform of local government in Ireland not only democratised and nationalised local government, not entirely the intention of the British government, but also enfranchised 100,000 women and made them eligible to stand in local elections. For such people, the limited opportunities for women in the Ireland of the 20s and 30s was very far from the promise of 1916. And it's significant, I think, that the subject of post-revolutionary disillusionment among dissident Irish intellectuals has emerged as part of the cultural history of the era referred to by the Taoiseach a few minutes ago, notably in a book by Francis Flanagan, a very interesting recent book. Another subject which has come into focus is the way that the organisation of Dolan managed the complex processes of local government in matters of clientelism and finance, which was charted long ago by Arthur Mitchell but has recently been returned to by Brian Hughes in a very interesting new book about the relations between the IRA and civilian communities in this period. And this laid very important groundwork for the way the new state evolved, as did the remarkable speed with which police and army authorities were reconstituted against a background of violence and antagonism. A lively debate has sprung up about the meaning of democracy as established in the Irish Free State and the competing notions of politics as epitomised at this time, which is another, I think, interesting instance of the kind of distinctions we heard about this afternoon. I think another important historiographical development in the recent writings is a concentration on what a campaign of violence meant for community relations in the country at large. This has been studied famously by Peter Hart, but also by Gemma Clark and by Anne Dolan, and also by Brian Hughes in the book I just mentioned. The restabilization of the 1920s was paralleled, of course, in many European countries which had experienced violent paramilitary activity. And I think we should realize that social conservatism, a turn towards censorship, and a deep-rooted fear of communism are not peculiar to Ireland in this period. But one very important factor influencing the way things developed concerns the fact that there had already been a quiet revolution in landholding, precipitated by the land war of 1879 to 81, then sustained by the government policy of enabling tenants to purchase their holdings. And as one revolutionary noted, this had the effect of curtailing the impulses towards social radicalism among those directing the political revolution against British rule. John Marcus O'Sullivan put it very clearly. He said in the early 20s, "It's well for us that the two revolutions through which we have passed in the last half-century were separate in time, that in fact the agrarian revolution was largely at an end before the struggle for national independence became fully acute. Had the two coincided, the outlook would indeed be menacing." His attitude, the inferred attitude, should be noted. And the conservative nature of Irish society was underwritten by the power of the Catholic Church in social as well as political terms, a syndrome reinforced or even enabled by the partition of Ireland, which made the Free State and later the Republic an almost entirely Catholic unit with a very small minority of Protestants who rapidly accepted the status of the new political entity and, initially at least, played a part in its commercial, economic and professional life disproportionate to their numbers. The Irish Free State provided a much warmer house, to use David Trimble's phrase, for its small Protestant minority than Northern Ireland did for its large Catholic minority, although there was nonetheless a disproportionate exodus of Protestants from the 26-county state in the early 1920s. How different a 32-county Ireland with a large, perhaps 25% minority Protestant population would have been is an intriguing counterfactual. Tom Garvin has suggested that if partition hadn't happened, we would have to look to the Balkans in the 1990s to get an idea of what Ireland would have been like, but others might be less pessimistic, myself among them. What also made Ireland's path to a certain extent sui generis was the power of the Catholic Church and the almost monolithic religious composition of the populace, along with the rapid development of a widely accepted, unarmed police force and a small and carefully regulated army. But there was also the implicit continuity of themes and forms of government inherited from the years of British rule. Despite the radicals' ambitions for a different dispensation, a two-party democratic bicameral parliamentary system evolved with a powerful and independent civil service, Despite a radically redrawn constitution in 1937, many legal forms and practices also bore strong family resemblances to Britain. And here's another area where the ideas of Sinn Féin fade into the background. Even economic protectionism, given the position of Ireland within the Commonwealth, took a back seat during the 20s until it was rediscovered, faute de mieux, by De Valera during the economic war of the 1930s. Speaking recently at the Irish Centre in Camden Town in London, I was asked why the Irish Revolution produced such a stable state, unlike other post-World War I revolutions in Central Europe and elsewhere. And my answer was that it did so for the same reason that the revolution succeeded in the first place. In other words, that the revolutionaries had the good fortune to be rebelling against a liberal democratic state, unlike the dissolving empires elsewhere in Europe. Because one outcome was Britain's responsiveness to domestic public opinion, which pushed Lloyd George to terms. Another outcome was that very stability which my questioner mentioned, which arose, as I've just outlined, from the fact that the new state mimicked so many of the legal, political, and cultural forms of the British government ethos. This was not the romantic utopia preached by the 1916 revolutionaries, but it was pretty effective nonetheless. And, moreover, it moved very swiftly to accommodating and friendly relations with the ex-oppressor. And this is what enabled the cynical Arthur Balfour, who had once been a Chief Secretary of Ireland as well as a Tory Prime Minister, to observe in 1928, "The Ireland of today is the Ireland we made." It also seems to me that the emphasis on historical victimhood and oppression, which was so marked in the rhetoric of the revolution, obscures the fact that in Edwardian Ireland, the obvious forms of oppression by England were in the past. While condescension and various forms of exclusion continued, the processes of land ownership, taxation reform, local government reform, old age pensions, and the clientelist hegemony of the Irish Parliamentary Party were creating in Ireland a materialist Anglophone world, which was exactly what the idealism of the revolutionary generation rebelled against. And here again, those two notions of freedom might be thought about. I can't say these were very well received ideas when I shared them with the Camden Irish Centre. And another audience member truculently remarked that all Ireland's post-revolutionary problems arose from the fact that the country had never adopted a truly Gaelic form of government. I didn't ask whether this meant reversion to the Brehon laws or the institution of High Kings, but the concept is a direct reversion to what Geoffrey Prager would call the Gaelic romantic versus the Irish Enlightenment tropes, which were argued out in the aftermath of revolution. I think that dichotomy, Prager's dichotomy, can be queried, but the caution and subtlety with which the constitutions of the Free State and then of ERA were drawn up deserve recognition. It was noted some time ago particularly that the 1922 Constitution cleverly incorporated elements of a nascent republican status into a framework formally designed to exist within the Commonwealth. The conservatism of the post-revolutionary state may be too easily decried. The power of the Church in matters of state and the implicit continuities from the era of British rule did make for social stability during an era of European upheaval in the 30s and 40s. But neither factor lying behind that stability could be openly acknowledged. And conservative Irish administrations operated within strict and coded parameters, with a partial exception when Clanna Publica looked like breaking the mold in the late 40s. The prevalence of large-scale emigration, especially of the young, helped sustain this stasis, and so did the low-key state of industrial unionization and of industry altogether. Well, the breaking up of the post-revolutionary dispensation has been much debated, along with the meaning of modernization Irish style, which Jolie and others have stimulatingly projected back into the aftermath of the famine in the mid to late 19th century. More predictably, the influence and the chronology of the shift to economic liberalization from the late 50s, 1950s, used to be taken as a sine qua non, along with the belated emergence of Sean Lemass as a modern-minded Taoiseach after the lengthy years of De Valera's ascendancy. More recent perspectives on this take a more sociological and a less high political view, and they see Ireland's trajectory as part of a global moment in the 1960s that brought both liberalization and instability. And here I think we might also note recent treatments of the Northern Ireland crisis by Prince Warner and others, which stressed the early 60s as a time of cautious reconciliation and liberalisation, derailed by the events of 1968 to 9 and after. In the Republic, the 60s certainly ushered in a period of interrogation and reassessment, featuring the women's movement and a challenging of religious and patriarchal authority. And I think that's notable, following, as it did, the uncomplicatedly triumphalist half-century celebrations of 1916 in 1966. So how many of the promises of the 1916 revolutionary generation had been put on ice for the ensuing half-century, and to what extent can the students' and women's and labour movements of the 60s and 70s be seen as a revival or even a rediscovery of some of the élan vital of the revolutionary generation? That's necessarily an open question, but reading the language, the concerns, the responses of the Edwardian generation of Irish radicals, as recorded in their letters, diaries, and journalism, the tone is sometimes oddly predictive of the 1960s generation. That generation, at least in France and America, has recently become the subject of large-scale academic collaborative research projects, often asking the question which that distinguished Galway woman, Augusta Gregory, asked about her generation of radicals: what was their utopia? That's the title of an unpublished essay by Lady Gregory, which was, I think, a profound influence on the gestation of Yeats's canonical poem, Easter 1916. But it's interesting that the huge corpus of testaments gathered by the Bureau of Military History don't often record the shape of the utopia that the ex-revolutionaries or old revolutionaries had wished for. They're much more dominated by remembering radicalization as coming from memories of historical oppression rather than economic immiseration in their immediate lives, much less socialism or feminism. These motivations are amply recorded in contemporary documentation of that period. Now, it's true that several of the people who would have been most motivated by those kind of motivations actually refused to give any testimony to the Bureau of Military History. But even so, I think we're seeing here an interesting example of the complex way that historical memory operates. And imagined utopias are part of any revolutionary impetus, for better or worse. And for better or worse, they rarely survive the onset of an economic boom, as would overtake Ireland in the 1990s. Before then, the anti-materialist ethos preached by De Valera, Liam Mellows, and others during the revolution, and the austere approach to public spending and balancing the books embraced by Cumann and Gael governments in the 20s, had instituted an ethos which helped, among other things, accustom independent Ireland to the idea that ostentatious prosperity was incompatible with true autonomy and a Christian and Gaelic way of life. The idea mooted by some Sinn Féin ideologues in the early 20th century that prosperity was compatible with independent Irishness, given a new approach to corporate economics and commercial policy, was allowed recede into history. This may have been a good thing in some ways, but it did leave the awkward question of Ireland's dependence upon British markets unanswered. A partial answer would eventually be provided by the expansion of Ireland's availability to inward investment, pioneered by the IDA from the 1950s, and the eventual establishment of multinational companies here from the 1990s with, as has been mentioned this afternoon, several taxation inducements. But the essential background to the break in that flat graph of prosperity was, I think, Ireland's joining the EEC in the early 70s with the attendant inward flow of money for infrastructural investment. The roller coaster of prosperity, the replacement of emigration by immigration, the less desirable concomitants of Wild West banking practices, and an unsustainable boom in building and property are very recent history. We've all been marked by them. But it's worth relating them to the ideas and ideals of 100 years ago, since they formed the backdrop to any 21st century assessment of how this country stands in its relation to its history and to the wider world. The fact that the background to Ireland's recent boom and bust involved an expansion of psychological as well as economic borders to that wider world is a central issue. One of the promises of independence was an end to the kind of poverty thought inseparable from colonial rule. Yet, as historians such as Cormac O'Grada and Tom Garvin have trenchantly shown, Ireland stayed poor after 1922. Indeed, De Valera had to effectively make a virtue of it, presenting it as an inseparable and even desirable part of Irish purity. Prosperity only came when Ireland once again joined a larger unit of government, the EEC, later the EU. A sharp question this afternoon raised the implication that this replicated the relationship to Britain. But I think EU membership was mostly seen in that period as an enhancement of independent sovereignty, rather than a diminution of it, until the rogue bankers and corrupt developers ruined the economy, and economic sovereignty was handed over to Brussels as the price of the bailout. That recent trauma was implicitly influential in the way the commemoration happened in the decade that began in 2012. So was the fact that over the previous decades, the Catholic Church had lost so much moral, social, and political authority compared to 1966. These two events or processes changed the way Ireland looked at itself. How much of the promise of 1916 has been belatedly redeemed, and at what cost? Recent history and current political considerations have always inflected the way we commemorate the independence, both this year and in other years. And as my chair, Mary Daly, has incisively shown, the question of commemoration came sharply into focus from the early years of the new Irish state, massaged and manipulated by civil servants, claimed by politicians, furiously reacted to by old revolutionaries or their relicts. And this is the result of a contested history and the unstated but continuing conflicts of the Civil War, which have been mentioned by previous speakers today. It raised a central question of what the revolution had been fought for and who had inherited it, and the powers that be, or that were, often used commemorative activities to stress militarism, which would convey the message of independence. This despite the fact that the army had become, in the words of one historian, a tiny internal security force combined with a squad of mounted ceremonial hussars and a jumping team. But there were less obvious demonstrations at work, too. The half-centenary of 1916, celebrated in 1966, was a matter not only of triumphalism, but of behind-the-scenes brinkmanship as to who was in and out, and those public spectacles of flypasts and demonstrations were intended very much as part of that process. The presence of Eamon de Valera added to the mystique, but also raised awkward questions when he and others used the commemorations to invoke a wish to complete the revolution by ending partition and reuniting the country. By the time of the 75th anniversary in 1991, given what was actually happening in the northeast of the island, a low-key approach was taken, covering up disagreements behind the scenes, particularly between Taoiseach Haughey, ex-gunrunner to the Provost, and President Mary Robinson, who had made a particular cause of listening to the Unionist case. Thus, partition remained the elephant in the room. It would later be claimed that the rhetorical revanchism of rhetoric in the Republic in 1966 helped galvanize Unionist resistance in the North, threatening that burgeoning liberalisation which I've hinted at already. I think that's a very vexed question. But the eruption from 1916 changed everything utterly, and the horrors to follow would entrench the border more firmly than ever before. What this meant for memory and history in Ireland is an enormous subject, not part of my lecture tonight. But it is relevant that the romantic faith and fatherland story of Irish liberation through sacrificial revolution and its assumption that there was one true church of Irish identity had already been queried by academic historiography. That 60 years ago, this year, Robin Dudley Edwards had dared to suggest that a necessary part of Irish national maturity must mean being able to ask whether 1916 was an unequivocally good thing. but questioning the Manichaean dualities of the received version remained largely within the scholarly community until the North blew apart at the end of the 1960s. Why a revisionist and often iconoclastic approach to Irish history then advanced into prominence clearly had much to do with the use being made of history by combatants in the North. But I think it also tapped into much wider historiographical influences from other countries and other cultures, ideas of history from below, the new social and intellectual history prospected by American historians, the Annales school in France, and so forth. Also, though it's not much mentioned, influential was a shift in Irish cultural attitudes, among the young at least, away from the obediently religious cast of mind which had inflected the interpretation of national history, a shift which had a great deal to do with the advent of radical feminism in the early 1970s. And here again, I think we can discern a revival of the preoccupations which had motivated at least some revolutionaries a half-century before. Faith and fatherland views had carried a strong charge of manifest destiny and the veneration of founding fathers. The more existentialist mentality of the 1960s preferred to investigate alternative futures and to see the past as a series of open questions. There was a certain reaction against this in the 1990s, described at the time as a more poised and self-confident period than the supposedly dreary era which preceded it and brought forth revisionism. But now that the gloss has worn off the poise and self-confidence of the Celtic Tiger era, the accompanying readiness to airbrush out awkwardnesses in the national history and to proclaim a fudged unity between past and present looks less convincing. And I think, and here I'm echoing the comments of An Taoiseach, there is a sense in which Irish historians have advanced in gingerly fashion towards a common ground where nuance is explored and sheep and goats are allowed mingled together. The commemorations this year, I think, have enabled and allowed this, and those of us who are sceptical at the outset must now admit it. It seems clear that memory, that awkward concept which has in some fashionable quarters replaced history, has been explored in a way that, as President Brown said this afternoon, has been allowed to complicate the national narrative, helped greatly by something else he also mentioned, the release and digitalization of all those first-person narratives, and the realization of those other identifications subscribed to in Ireland 100 years ago, notably with regard to the First World War. We've also perhaps learned something about other commemorative events in Ireland, such as the 150th anniversary of the onset of the Great Famine in 1995 and the bicentenary of the 1798 Rising in 1998. The memory of the famine allowed for a certain amount of well-meant but sometimes questionable psychotherapeutic statements about trauma, survivor guilt, and collective memory, and the imposition of silence on communal memory of that awful time, though anyone who grew up in rural Ireland knew that was not really true, and several folklore scholars, some of them of this parish, crisply pointed out as much. More relevantly and lastingly, a number of famine museums were created, and local history investigations led to some genuine advances in historical knowledge, and there was some brilliant pioneering scholarship published. A few years later, the bicentenary of 1798 told a rather different story. Again, there were several illuminating exhibitions, some suggestive scholarship, and the rest, but the Irish government of the day took a leading part and a highly politicized role, galvanized by the peace process then unfolding in the North. The fact that Northern Presbyterians, 200 years before, had been in the vanguard of revolutionary Republican activity was too good to pass up. So a determined effort was made to equate the project of the late 18th century United Irishmen to the efforts of Irish politicians in the present day. Two eras of supposed cross-community reconciliation were breathlessly twinned, and late 20th century Eurospeak was applied to the French revolutionary connections of the rebels. Now, I think it's a general truth that the political use of historical parallels tends to completely discount questions of context and change. We've seen this very recently with Donald Trump's supporters paralleling his utter lack of experience in any elected office to that of Abraham Lincoln. Hardly a relevant exemplar, or the equally far-fetched claims of British Brexiteers who compare the decision to leave Europe this year to the Henrician repudiation of papal authority in the 16th century. In the Ireland of 1998, this kind of time travelling meant dismissing the sectarian realities of the late 18th century as retrospective rationalizations and airbrushing out incidents of cross-community violence. The historical narrative was resolutely uncomplicated in the interests of present political realities. Now, this seems to me exactly what the commemorative organisation attending to 1916 in 2016 managed to avoid, and I'm not just saying that because Maurice Manning is in the room. The official approach expressed by President and Taoiseach laudably emphasised aspects that are inclusive and celebratory, while also recognising the countering traditions in Irish politics 100 years ago, both Home Ruler and Unionist. It should be remembered that revolutionary consciousness is necessarily also about extremism, enmity, repudiation, and what Yeats roundly called fanaticism and hatred. And here again, I would instance the many fascinating and sometimes chilling studies of what violence meant at local level that have been done by scholars in the last few years. But this often means that rationalization of pre-revolutionary conditions plays a large part in official memory, trying to smooth out awkward, ambiguous, iconoclastic elements and prioritizing the feel-good side. There are also the imperatives of the tourist industry. But to their credit, the government has avoided this. And though the committee in charge of commemorations was originally criticised in some quarters for what seemed to be a cautious and equivocal approach by those who wanted more straightforward celebration and the assertion of a direct and unproblematic line of dissent, they stuck to their guns. That question of direct and unproblematic lines of dissent stays with us. Long ago, in the early 1930s, W.B. Yeats, who was no enemy to the aristocratic principle, remarked that in the future, to have an ancestor who had been in the post office in 1916 would be tantamount to an American claiming descent from someone who'd sailed on the Mayflower. And in this, as in many other ways, he was uncannily prescient. But it must be admitted that in commemorating 1916, we're doing something very different from remembering the famine or remembering 1798. Those events were in different ways disasters, representing tragedy and failure on a national scale. The 1916 Rising, by contrast, does mark a foundational point in the history of the state, and those who planned it are necessarily seen as founders of that state. Now, this has been queried in some quarters, not only in the letters column of the Irish Times, but in even more weighty places. But it seems to me a given. There are, as this lecture has tried to point out, complicating factors. We can't tell how far the state which emerged after the Anglo-Irish Treaty would have been endorsed by the signatories of the Proclamation of the Republic in 1916, since they were executed. Yeats, again, wrote, "We know their dream, enough to know they dreamed and are dead." But if we try from contemporary sources to get closer to what they actually dreamed, to find out what was their utopia, in Augusta Gregory's phrase, much of it seems rather far removed from the ethos of the Free State, while some aspects of it have arguably come to fruition in the near century of independence, which has seen the country become what it is today. Though I've warned against time travelling, I think part of the commemorative process must mean looking at the ideals of the revolutionaries as they affect today's Ireland. And that's what we're trying to do at this conference. This might be so particularly regarding equality of opportunity, a genuinely representative government, investment in social issues and cultural capital, and democratic accountability. To pick up again on a comment of Philip Pettit's, it's generally admitted, or it should be, that these priorities were heavily compromised by the continuing effects of the austerity imposed by the Philistine excesses and idiocies of the boom. And this, and the challenge it presented to government, might deserve more consideration than the sensitivities of those descended from rebels or the appropriateness of a visit from a member of the House of Windsor. And some of the generous budgets set aside for commemorative purposes should certainly be directed towards enhancing or even just rescuing some of the threatened major cultural institutions of the state. The revolution was created in colleges, in theatres, in libraries, as well as in the GPO. And sustaining such places is a more meaningful act of commemoration than many more ephemeral acts. In conclusion, Ireland in 2016 is inevitably a very different place from in 1916. We can't ignore that it looked different again in 2006, only 10 years ago, just before the crash. And we can't organise peace walls, and we can't ignore peace walls in the north and ghost estates in the south, nor the deficit of accountability in certain aspects of Irish public life, nor the fact that the crash course with Europe recently embarked upon by Britain threatens to impact powerfully upon this country, reminding us that due to propinquity as well as history, our ancient relationship with the larger island stubbornly survives for better or worse. History's been made all around us, and 2016 will be remembered worldwide for more disruptive events than merely commemorating a revolution in Ireland. Still, it seems to me important that we try to recapture in 2016 the wish of the revolutionaries to make a different world, or many different worlds, that did not resemble the restrictive and quasi-theocratic state that emerged in the 20s. Stable and admirable though it was, in many ways, it denied many people the futures they had wanted and expected. The proclamation stressed equality of status and opportunity as a concomitant of independence from Britain. But the emergence of an Irish establishment on several levels was an inevitable part of post-revolutionary history, with the kind of resettlement that created the Ireland we know today, and still more the Ireland some of us remember growing up in. The new Ireland was, and for most of the 20th century remained, partitioned, English-speaking, politically conservative, well-educated, and inevitably marked by its propinquity to and historical relationship with Britain. By the early 21st century, though, models taken from Boston and Berlin seemed more relevant than London, and the European dimension of our recent history dominated the experience of the crash. And it was also, that European context, was the context in which Ireland regained some measure of sovereignty after European intervention and sectional economic recovery. The future historian of 21st Ireland will have to relate this economic roller coaster to the implications for Ireland of Britain's withdrawal from the EU, and probably to whatever instability of the world order is now upon us since Tuesday's tsunami in the USA. This is not my job, I'm very grateful to say. And where the ideals and promises of 1916 relate to that future scenario is an open question. The revolutionary generation could not have anticipated the uncertainty of Ireland's situation in today's globalized world. But without entrenching upon the concerns of other speakers and other activities at this conference, it may explain why so much of this year's concentration on remembering the promise of 1916 and its relevance to Ireland today has stressed, as did the Taoiseach in his conclusion, the country's cultural and artistic achievements, which cannot be gainsaid. Because these, less problematically, take us back to the world of the revolutionary generation who wanted to make it new and partially did. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roy, that was a remarkable tour de force, 100 years of Irish history in 50 minutes, and it was 50 minutes. We were talking about the length beforehand. And I think it links back with Philip Pettit earlier this afternoon, and it also, I think, foreshadows a lot of the themes that we will be dealing with in the days to come. So we're going to follow that with a series of commentaries by a panel of 5 speakers, beginning with Professor Anne Dolan of Trinity College. Anne, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Roy. The trouble is, I agree with an awful lot of what you've just said, but let me take a slightly contrary line, not least because these good people have not come to listen to us all agree. Let me play devil's advocate for those without what Roy has called a distinctly radical voice, for those who do not find themselves obviously among the dissident, the disillusioned, or the lyrically discontent. Let me get back to the muddle of what Roy referred to as the stasis. A few months back in March, Olivia O'Leary wrote an article in The Guardian contrasting the promise of gender equality in the 1916 proclamation with the grim realities for women once independence came. And she said, most of the dreamers and visionaries had been shot in 1916. The dream of a radical, free Ireland was lost, as she put it, under a more pragmatic and conservative leadership after 1922. For women, for gender equality, substitute the word, noun, phrase, or disillusionment of your choice. The centenary of Easter 1916, for all that we have danced and sung and seminared our way through its every twist and turn and obscure part, has prompted a steady holding of ourselves to some sort of higher account. There has been a rather eager trumpeting of all that we have failed to do, of just how much we've disgraced, reneged, degraded, and betrayed the ideals of the men of 1916. Indeed, President Michael D. Higgins declared as follows that land and private property, a restrictive religiosity, and a repressive pursuit of respectability, affecting women in particular, became the defining social and cultural ideals of the new independent Ireland, that Connolly's hopes for the Republic remain damningly unfulfilled. Just as the school children of Ireland were pressed back in March to worry away at a new proclamation for a new generation, to dream up the ideals they would prescribe for themselves, this chiding ourselves to do better, these timely reminders of the idealism we should always have before our eyes, might well spur us on to better, brighter future things. As a mere historian, I'll wait and see, but as a historian of this much traduced newly independent Ireland, I might just have to intervene. Independent Ireland has already had its share of critics without coming under this new assault from our latest conception of 1916. It was certainly not the romantic utopia, as Roy said, that which was preached in 1916. It has been written as a disappointment, as a flat, narrow place that lost the courage of its own revolution's convictions, a cruel, timid place that was hard on its weakest and too much in thrall to those who preached right from wrong. It is perceived as stubborn and wrong-headed, too accepting of its failures, too proud of its own parsimony, too quick to sacrifice another generation just to get by. Above all, it is conceived in anger at those who seemed content to shut out the world and to let paralysis thrive. Though praise still comes for the feat of state building, for establishing a state in civil war, for consolidating it through the uneasy times beyond, the compliment is wearing thin. It has become harder just to admire the bricks and mortar, the more that becomes known about all the kinds of threadbare life inside. Of course, the realities of independence were always going to let the expectations down. We were by no means the only new state in post-war Europe to learn the hard way of that. Unlike many of the others, though, we did survive. We had probably some of the most stable 1920s and 30s in Europe, and we avoided the excesses of political extremes when much of Europe began to march to the rhythms of a fascist or a communist jackboot. Stability was a valuable commodity in interwar Europe, however much it seemed to look like stasis after 1945. But what we see as the disappointment of independence can hardly be otherwise when we look back at it through the 1950s, the 1980s, when we look back through the disappointments of now. But what independence might have been or could have been or should have been is more a mantra of our own discontents, our own sense that at some point it all went wrong and not fixing it was someone else's fault. Voicing his disappointment with the prospect of censorship in 1928, George Bernard Shaw complained, "The average man is a coward." And so much of the disappointment with this period of Irish history we are seeing now in the rising centenary seems to echo the condescension of this same sentiment. And yet so much that is now perceived as conservatism in that new Free State often had overwhelming popular support, even had advocates prepared to push for what may seem to us now even greater repression. The voices that spoke up for women's rights were largely ignored. The failure to raise the school-leaving age because the need for child labour was too pressing for too long. These and so many other examples suggest people were not always thwarted. They just were not prepared to do as we hoped they should have done. Hindsight might long to find a different kind of independent Ireland, to find a radical social revolution as dreamed up by all the diverse interpretations of the proclamation, of the rising, of what went before, that seem to proliferate today. But if electoral results are any measure, then independent Ireland showed little appetite for more than what it got. It may be the blunt historian in me, but it was what it was. The moral cowards, as Shaw might call them, as Olivia O'Leary, as even the President, as many more have and continue now to call them, made their own choices, took their own risks, chose which opportunities they wanted to escape as well as to miss. Some upstart will stand here or somewhere like it in 100 years' time and will have real fun with the mess we are still and have been in. E.P. Thompson called it the enormous condescension of posterity, and by God, posterity will condescend to us in turn. We are being challenged by this centenary, and particularly by the way it has been framed in terms of reimagining the Republic, to be inspired by the hope and the ambition of the Rising and its leaders. But it has prompted an outrageous presumption on many parts to hold the past to account by standards that are at best half-baked and at worst poorly, if even ever defined. How can we write of the failures of Irish independence, as some have, without a sense of what we mean by what anyone at the time could have conceived of as success? Even if what Shaw called, as he put it, the few million moral cowards on that little grass patch may well have been slipping back into the Atlantic, they did so according to their own lights. They no doubt imagined their futures with the same excitement and exhilaration as those who see a rampant idealism in 1916 here and now. What they did, what they imagined, what they tried and achieved and failed may not suit us, may not sit well with us, but they are still the mess and the stuff of us all the same. We have as much Valley of the Squinting Windows in us as we have Connolly or MacDonagh or Pearse. For Patrick Lynch, writing in 1966, independence amounted to the social revolution that never was. And most historians have accepted his traditional sense of what that revolution should have been. Lynch felt that in independent Ireland, as he put it, the conventional wisdom of Whitehall far outweighed that of Connolly or Pearse, but his sense of an abstract social revolution, just like the complaints of many of the people in this centenary, may just reflect a will to impose a chronology that simply does not fit or ties itself too easily to social change following political upheaval as straightforwardly as night seems to follow day. If there was a social revolution, it probably predated the political one, as Roy argues, and did not need to wait for Easter 1916. We may need to look to the changes of the late 19th and early 20th centuries in terms of land ownership and local government, and in terms of the changing expectations of more relief that came with changes such as the old age pension in 1908. A small farmer was able to speak in the mid-1920s of what he called what had been gained by the land revolution. What had been gained by the political revolution had not yet come into his consciousness. Whatever either revolution meant to him, they were distinctly separate things. Sorry, but it does not come in any neat and tidy, convenient centenary shape. Our criticism now seems based on a very narrow sense of what a social revolution might or should have been. It is one made in our own predictable image, not on what might have been revolutionary on contemporary terms. Social revolution might have come in the shape of a crystal radio set. It may have come with the crackling of gramophones breaking the silence, in the records that brought jazz to Belmullet and Caruso to the tenements. It may have come with access to running water, to electricity, to more shop-bought goods, with more sociability, more houses, more bicycles, more cars. For a Miss Newton of the big house, as Pádraig Cullum described it in 1926, social revolution was plain. We have had a great come down. We were once everything in the country and now we count for hardly anything at all. For her, he writes, the real signs of an accomplished revolution came in who administered local power. The head of the civic guard in her area was, as he put it, the son of the smith who used to shoe Miss Newton's horse. Cullum saw it in a trader's widow who could put up an altar in the chapel, as he said, at the cost of £1,000. He saw it in the grandson of a labourer who was now the richest man in the place. It was perhaps born of narrow ambition, but it was a social revolution on their terms nonetheless. This is not a plea for a swing to some other extreme, for the kind of revisionist debate that has shaped the history of interwar Britain recently. Some have strayed from the road to Wigan Pier because for them too many spent too much on cars and golf clubs and bungalows for Orwell to have it all his own way. But it is not about replacing the disappointed version of Irish independence that we've been hearing so much of lately with some blindly buoyant view, trading in the worst of times for the best of times because a few contemporaries felt we had everything before us after all. It is more of an attempt to draw a line of some sort in these treacherous commemorative sands, holding a period, God, even a whole state to account by our current expectations, is certainly one of the historian's cardinal rules broken. Holding a period, a people, a state to account by the ideals of a group of men who had no mandate for the violence they unleashed is probably a far graver sin. If independent Ireland left behind the radical vision of the proclamation, it did so because it wanted to, because those who conceived that vision failed to consult or fathom those in whose name they presumed to rebel. In every period since independence, we have been lucky enough to get the governments we have wanted and maybe even deserved. And we have been independent long enough now to only have ourselves to blame for gender equality, child poverty, homelessness, and all the other things we are prepared to admit we need to fix. Olivia O'Leary's dreamers and visionaries might be the florid and poetic stuff of centenary commemorations, but I'm afraid my sympathies lie with the strivers and the strugglers of independent Ireland who had the courage to live for Ireland, come what may. The strivers and the strugglers who deserve more than the sum of our disappointment because they lived lives that were far more vivid than our current passion for commemoration seemed to allow. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. That was terrific. Our second speaker is Professor Tony McGarrigle of the University of Limerick.
Thank you, Mary. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not an historian of Ireland. I'm here to maybe throw another dimension on the Irish experience, and also possibly to act as agent provocateur in some respects. I'm going to read this rather quickly. I think I may have overestimated or underestimated my the length of this talk, this comment. I want to, first of all, talk about context, and then I want to, at worst, posit a counterfactual, or at best a question, before going on with a provocation about the similarities and suggestive parallels to elsewhere in Europe. I'm an historian of Germany in that dark period of the early 20th century. And then I'm going to try and redeem myself with an observation. I'll begin, first of all, by recalling the launch of the project, a decade of centenaries commemorating shared history, 1912 to 1922, at a conference in UCD in May 2010, when the former Taoiseach, Brian Cowan, observed, I quote, "A momentous decade, a century ago, defined so much about Ireland for the 20th century." And he continued, "Our island story cannot be accurately viewed or properly understood through a single prism." He also went on to show, he was at pains to show, how the story of the two islands' shared experience, especially around this year of that we are discussing, 1916, had to be situated into a broader and transnational context. Now, in his talk this evening, Professor Foster refers to a global moment in the 1960s that brought economic, social liberalization and instability. But implicit in his talk is the earlier global moment of the first decade of that century that enables us to reassess, I would argue, the Irish experience as part of a larger canvas of European and international events and transformation in the early decades. There are a number of obvious and legitimate reasons for this. Not only was Ireland, as part of the British Empire, affected by the tides of the Great War. This is the year of the Somme, with its Irish fatalities as well. But for our purpose today, the Easter Rising and its completion, or compromised completion, on the 6th of December 1922, with the creation of the Free State, falls within a decade of nationalist and popular upheaval, when a series of revolutionary putches, as Professor Foster refers to them, or national rebellions and popular insurrections challenged or destroyed imperial powers, dynasties across the globe. Now, the American sociologist Michael Mann, in his magnus opus, has referred to this as part of the waves of revolution, which extend back to the middle of the 18th century. But more recently, John Darwin, a colleague of Professor Foster's in Oxford, has shown how the period 1916 to 1923 were years of great upheaval, bringing to an end an era of relative peace, which he located in the short, what he calls the short 19th century. Where there were revolutions, they tended to be extra-European, in Mexico, China, Turkey, Iran. So this is the period of an era of revolutions and upheavals, starting possibly with the Young Turk Revolution in July 1908, which is brought to a conclusion in 1923, the Mexican Revolution, 1910 to 1920, the overthrow of the Qing or the Manchu dynasty in China by Sun Yat-sen in 1911, completed in 1923-25, the Liberal Revolution of 1905-06 in Russia, which re-established the Duma as the National Assembly, followed by popular protests in Petrograd in February 1917, and then the Bolshevik revolutionary putsch the following October with its particular dynamic of violence. And then there were the Bread and Peace protests across Central Europe, including Germany, which involved the workers, soldiers, and sailors in 1918 that eventually forced the abdication of the Hohenzollern Emperor on the 9th of November that year. Now, Professor Foster asks asks whether or not 1916 is a revolutionary putsch, or was it a stage in a continuum that stretched from 1912 to 1922? In my mind, these are not mutually exclusive categories, and I'm sure he would probably agree with that, but the allusion to an idea of stages or phases in a process that might provide the necessary preconditions towards national liberation as empires were forced to relinquish their colonies over several decades in some cases can be helpful. So I want to take, first of all, the first part of, or the first R in Professor Foster's talk, radicalism. Most revolutionary organizations or movements have a program or a manifesto in which its key aims are usually set down. And of course, in this case, the proclamation of 1916 is that manifesto. But how radical was it? In the context of its time, we can say it was indeed radical, both in its claim to the right of self-determination, the unfettered control of Irish destinies, and thus anticipating point 5 of Wilson's 14 points of January 1918, that clearly sets out aims of national and social emancipation to be delivered by a provisional government to be formed by the 7 signatories, no doubt. Furthermore, its promise of equal suffrage and equal opportunities, as well as reconciling the two traditions, Catholic nationalist, Protestant unionist, was consonant of liberal and left progressive thinking on emancipation and consensus at that time. And here I think of, for instance, the father of the Weimar Constitution, on whom I've written, Hugo Preuss, or indeed, in Germany, or indeed Leon Trotsky's essay on women, where he wrote about from the old family to the new in July 1923 in Russia. So these were emancipatory texts, essentially. Moreover, the proclamation spoke to something else that emerges in those years, and that is what we now call the imaginary of a different future to the trajectory offered by the present. And Professor Dolan has referred to that, and so too has Professor Foster. Historians have now begun to turn their attention to this aspect of mentalité in order to explain the actions of ordinary people in, as well as leaders of, revolution. The proclamation was utopian, we are told, and it validated itself by the past risings, but as we know, it claimed a better future for the Irish people as citizens. But no two imaginaries were necessarily the same. The vocabulary of revolution might appear to offer a gloss of similarity, but as recent work has shown, for instance, that of Rebecca Karl on the Chinese Revolution, these words might be the same, but they don't necessarily have the same meaning for those who are using them. Indeed, even the meaning of citizenship, like revolution, varied according to place. Now, the second R, namely radicalization in the title of his talk, was absent in the Irish case, initially at least. Was the spectacle of wartime mass demonstrations, we have to contextualize this, of course, we mustn't forget the war, over material conditions and protests against the war evident in the country, from Belfast to Cork, from Dublin to Limerick, as they were elsewhere. The waves of civilian protests on the various home fronts in continental Europe, eventually merging with dissent among soldiers on furlough from the front, the ineptitude of wartime governments to manage their war economies in such a way as to shield their populations, eventually led to what the Dublin historian John Horne many years ago referred to as a desacralisation of the state. There were protests in Britain and within the British Empire, but by and large, it remained immune to the corrosive aspects of dissent and protest in the short term at least. They really come after the war in 1919, 1920. The radicalisation, when it comes in Ireland, is a response, a reaction to the suppression of the rising itself. Now, I can't really comment on resettlement, but I will try and refer to that a little bit in my conclusion. The question is, how do revolutions end? So in his lecture, Professor Foster shows how the ideological visions at work, citing the radical ideas of Sinn Féin, Labour and feminist activities, what we have termed, or what we see as the revolutionary imaginary, became marginalised by upheavals and military struggles of the period. The openness of historical events later are closed down by meta-narratives as they emerge to script a particular history and to validate the issuing state. I mentioned that 1916 ends with the establishment of the Free State in 1922. This stretching of the event and the period is now largely in keeping with recent trends in the historiography of the war and revolutions in Europe. And Roy Foster has referred to the work of Robert Gareworth and John Horne, among others, and one could cite a number of other historians in this regard. Recently, at a symposium or conference in Hanover, there was a discussion about counter-revolutions as a global phenomenon. We've been talking in recent years about the globalization of revolutions of this period, but the concomitant to the revolutions is, of course, the counter-revolution. This is the flip side to the era of revolutions. Now, this entailed, in Hanover, a rethinking or a reworking of the concept of revolution. Its meaning, going back to what I said earlier, nobody has necessarily the same understanding of what it meant. And to give you an idea of that, was it a national revolution? The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 was what we today might call a coup by officers. Was it a social revolution of the type that Professor Dolan has referred to? Was it a constitutional revolution, which is where I would place the German Revolution? Was it a proletarian revolution, as in Russia, ostensibly? Or was it an authoritarian revolution, which is how the fascist dictatorship that emerges in Italy after 1922 and then in Germany after 1933 have often been referred to. So you see there are already these different competing ideas of what revolution is. But it has a bearing on what the counter-revolution might look like. And it's here where I want to have that little provocation. Ireland, of course, one might argue, has traits of which are a combination of these different types of revolution that I have just referred to. However, I want to state, and as I mentioned to you earlier, I'm not an historian of Ireland, the authoritarian clerical state that emerges in Ireland in the post-1916 period, especially after the founding of the Free State, also shares some of the traits of the counter-revolutionary restoration, which is balanced on a spectrum ranging from increasingly authoritarian democracies. Here I would include Britain after the landslide, the Conservative landslide victory in 1935, and then the introduction of draconian laws affecting civil liberties, to the totalitarian military regimes on the continental periphery, to the one-party dictatorships, all of which sought to subdue or quash and quell or channel the revolutionary imaginary and its elan into more tighter channels of or tributaries of water. Is it possible that this restoration began with the reneging of one core principle of the proclamation itself, namely cherishing all the children of the nation equally and oblivious of the differences carefully fostered by an alien government which have divided the minority from the majority in the past? The reference to children here, of course, is to the people of Ireland, not to all the people of Ireland. The internecine violence that becomes evident both later in the Anglo-Irish War, which blurs into the Civil War, and indeed after, bore in some communities or some areas resemblances to the sort of ethnic cleansing that took part in parts of Europe from the Baltic to the Balkans at the end of the Great War, and which resurged again during the Second World War. Restoration was not, however, just by means of violent suppression. Here, language and symbolism is important, from the choice of Taoiseach, 1937, in the 1937 Constitution, harking back to the Gaelic chieftain, or contextualized in the 1930s, its correlate would be Duce in Italy or Führer in Germany. There were structural resemblances too. For many, the island, based on the 26 counties that emerged from the treaty, was intolerant of difference, and its leaders, allegedly, constricted the imagination at all levels of society. Why was it that Samuel Beckett could only articulate his modernism in Paris, for instance? The presence of the Catholic Church, Professor Foster's quasi-theocracy, as social and political arbiter, had its counterpart in Franco's Spain, and did much to confine women to motherhood and the kitchen hearth, suppressing the feminist ideals and impulses which had been such a key element of 1916. So the Irish experience in this period should also be read as part of European transnational history. The timing of the rising bears comparison with similar revolts and insurrections taking place elsewhere in Europe and beyond. The revolutionaries in Dublin, the role of the trade unions, etc., or even the Limerick Soviet, which is really just a trades council, can be fruitfully compared to that of Bolsheviks or the Workers' Council Soviets in the metal shops of Moscow or Petrograd, or in Berlin, or in the Ruhr, or in Kiel, or the Spartacus organization and the Workers' Councils, as I mentioned, in Berlin. The violence that characterizes these years, culminating in the myriad atrocities of that upheaval of from 1919 to 1921-22, also should be framed by the violence of the war. And it cannot be understood, it seems to me, without doing that, taking that into account, I know. And of course, the aftermath. So, in conclusion, my hurried observations, which I hope might redeem my rather offbeat approach to this topic, is that each generation writes histories of the past through the lens of their own contemporary world. And we've heard this, 1966, 1991. Sometimes that lens reflects a deficit. When we look at the past, maybe we look for something more positive that is absent in the present. Historical memory, of course, and this is where much of the scholarship is today, not just in Ireland, but right across the world in the historical profession. Scholarship today is now turning more and more to historical memory. I share some of the reservations that Professor Foster has, but we cannot exclude these forgotten voices. And happily to say that my colleagues here are not part of that process of exclusion, but inclusion, and which, of course, is what we are doing here today. So, thank you.
I will learn not to clap close to the microphone. It's at some point. Thank you very much, Tony. And now for a change, Dr. Riona Fhrighil of NUI Galway is going to address cultural and Irish language issues. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. I should point out that I'm not a historian. I'm a literary scholar. I work in the Irish language. It's good to manage expectations. Professor Foster has demonstrated compellingly that to survey the pre-revolution era, through the lens of nationalist politics is to capture only part of a much bigger picture. It leads us to underestimate the extent to which other dynamic social movements influenced the ideals of the pre-revolutionary generation. One of those movements was, of course, the Irish language revival movement. Traditionally, this has been surveyed in terms of cultural nationalism. That paradigm, however, ignores the extent to which the language revival movement was very much informed by contemporary European thought, especially by Darwinism and about theories about race extermination, cultural decline, and degeneration. This morbid narrative was, of course, contested by others who placed their hopes in regenerations of different types. It is in this wider mainstream European context, according to Professor Riona, that we best understand the impetus to revive the Irish language at that particular time in history, the second half of the 19th century. We have ample evidence from contemporary newspapers and literary journals in both languages that those involved in the revival of the Irish language kept abreast of other language movements in Europe at the time, not out of political and cultural interest alone, but sometimes out of a sheer linguistic interest, as many of those central to the language movement were themselves multilinguals. Language revivalists, however, often don't fare well in historical accounts of the period, generally because the most conservative positions in the Gaelic League, such as those of An Tathair Peadar Ó Laoghaire or Father Richard Hennebree, are presented as typical and as representative of an entire movement. Professor Philip O'Leary's in-depth study of the Gaelic revival, however, tellingly subtitled Ideology and Innovation, dispels this oversimplistic notion and demonstrates that those involved in the movement were indeed a motley crew. They spanned a spectrum from conservative nativists to cosmopolitan progressives. The Irish language biographies of 583 revivalists, compiled by Diarmaid Brannach and Máire Ní Mhorchu over a 25-year period from the mid-1980s onwards, bear out Professor Foster's own research on emblematic figures of the revolutionary generation. Brannach and Ní Mhorchu outlined the personal histories of revivalists from a diversity of backgrounds. They profiled their complex, multifaceted identities and their simultaneous engagement in other social movements. I believe that to combine the scholarship of both languages would bring those vivid faces into sharper focus. The trajectory from radical idealism to conservatism to economic liberalisation and its aftermath, as outlined by Professor Foster, can be traced in canonical 20th century Irish language texts, not because influential writers represented historical reality in their writings, but more generally because they critiqued that reality through various literary modes. Pádraig Ó Conradh, for example, resorted to the grotesque in his anti-capitalist novel Deoraíocht, or Exile, of 1910. Miles na Gcapaill implied satire and over-literalism in his acerbic novel An Béal Beocht, or The Poor Mouth, of 1941, where the character's Irishness or Gaelicism is inversely proportionate to their material wealth. Martin O'Kane, incensed and often disillusioned by many aspects of state policy in relation to the Gaeltacht and to the language itself, simply interred his characters in his 1949 novel Cray na Cille, or Graveyard Clay. In Moira Wakathy's poem Carunchi Wair Niogan, or Mary Hogan's Quatrains, published in 1956, the defiant, sexually active female persona challenged conventional morality head-on, declaring, and I quote, "I care little for people's suspicions, I care little for priests' prohibitions, for anything save to lie stretched between you and the wall." Eoin Ó Tuairisc's 1966 novel, Jeluan, or Monday, mixed internal monologue and historical sources with multiple viewpoints to explore the tension between idealism and reality, questioning, as many have done since then, the mythology and the iconography of the Rising. This novel is a far cry from uncomplicated triumphalist celebration. The overview I've just given is necessarily brief and in some ways very inadequate, for it suggests that Irish language literature is confined to the domestic context and that its contestations are aimed at state and church institutions. This ignores, however, the strong transnational component in the corpus of 20th and 21st century Irish language literature. The best known include Ono Tuirish's Afran na Marav, or Mass of the Dead, written in the wake of Hiroshima, Marawakati's poem Shao, or Shoah, written in response to the Holocaust, Nuala Ní Dhomhnall's poem Du, or Black, written on the fall of Srebrenica in July 1995, and Alan Titley's novella Glúiseacht, or Movement, written in 2009 and in advance of the so-called EU refugee crisis, a novel which describes the treacherous sea journey of an unaccompanied minor leaving Africa to seek haven in Europe. These are but a few examples of the human rights discourse clearly discernible in a language which is itself, of course, the language of a minority. Irrespective, however, of its marginalised position, or indeed maybe partly because of it, Irish language writers, along of course with their English language counterparts, are also enthusiastic translators. Nuala Ní Dhomhnall has translated poems by Jewish poet Paul Celan and Bosnian poet Frida Durakovic. Brendan O'Divlin has translated short stories by the Slovenian writer and activist Drago Jankar, while Gabriel Rosenstock has translated an anthology of poems by Guantanamo prisoners. Not only do such works of literary collaboration allow protesting voices to be heard beyond their native contexts, but they are also timely reminders that intercultural dialogue depends on translation and multilingualism. These texts also challenge Irish readers, citizens of a Western democratic state, to consider how we are implicated in others' sufferings, and to reflect upon how some of us are socially and politically positioned to possess human rights, while others are simply not, even though these human rights are purportedly universal. To conclude then, we live in a time of great ironies. In a post-Brexit era where thousands of Britons are applying for Irish citizenship, where British Jews are applying for German citizenship, where the trending Google search on Tuesday night as the US presidential results became apparent was how to move to Canada. And we tout our monolingualism, apparently with no sense of irony, the only European English-speaking member state. On one hand, we repent for the history of an institutionalization in our state, while continuing to keep thousands of people in direct provision centres, literally in a state of limbo. Cultural identities now, as ever, are being constructed and reconstructed and claimed as geopolitical and social contexts change. While we must always, of course, be alert to the dangers of undifferentiated universalism, our increasing interconnectedness with others demand that we be, in the words of Seamus Heaney, citizens of the Republic of Conscience, or as Sean O'Riordan put it succinctly in an early formulation of what we would now call intercultural citizenship, Ní Cadva Neau Him. Indifference cannot be tolerated. Gurmai.
Gurmai Riona. And now for another change of theme, I want to welcome the distinguished historian of Irish Labour, Professor Emmet O'Connell, to talk to us from the University of Ulster, to talk to us in response to Roy's paper. And I presume you'll be dealing with Labour.
Thank you, Professor Daly, Taoiseach, distinguished guests, and a cordial glare. I'm very pleased to be invited and back here in Galway. It seemed to change all the time. I remember the time when there used to be a terrapin here called the Green Man, so called after the names of many pubs in England. I suppose it made the students feel at home. But I must say I feel a bit nostalgic for the old UCG, even as I recognise the great advances that the college has made. But changing too, I think, has been a feature of the current centenary commemorations, and this is something alluded to by the Taoiseach and by Roy Foster when they talked about the openness and the embrace of legacy and the creativity that surrounded the current commemorations. I was there to some extent, I think, in 1966, but it was more likely to be shouted in from the wings by fringe radical groups. I'd like to make 3 points in relation to this question of legacy and the promise of 1916. The first, I think, is to echo what other speakers have made. Roy Foster made it, I think other speakers also tonight, the importance of the international context. But I would go further and I would argue that this is really a fundamentally important way of looking at Irish history right from the late 18th century, because the 18th century changed the geopolitical context of Ireland from being a cul-de-sac on the edge of Europe to being in the middle of this hugely important highway of commerce and ideas between Northern Europe and North America. And it's almost impossible, I think, to understand the major political movements in Ireland since the Volunteers of 1778 without reference to international events. Let me give you some examples of what I mean. How often have we heard, the Celtic Twilight interpreted with reference to Yeats's essay, arguing that people got sickened with politics following the fall of Parnell and they all turned to culture. I mean, that has always seemed to me to be most implausible. Yeats knew as much about people as I do about writing poetry. People don't work like that, and I think a more compelling reason, I think there are 2 compelling reasons. One was Anglicisation and the fact that Irish culture just seemed to be melting away in the late 19th century. It wasn't just a question of the language, but everything from pantomime to how we celebrated Christmas and so on, were adopting the English way. Most people went along with that, but there were bound to be some people who didn't like it. And the other reason, I think, is that it was the global ethic at the time, even in so-called multicultural America. Games like baseball and gridiron were promoted as distinctively American games. Teddy Roosevelt, former president, made a famous speech in 1916 in which he said we must have no more Irish Americans, Italian Americans, Jewish Americans, no more hyphenated Americans. No one, everybody must be an American. Another example is the Democratic Programme, so often explained as a thank you to Labour for standing down from the 1918 general election. The Democratic Programme had nothing to do with the 1918 general election. It had everything to do with the International Socialist Conference in Bern in Switzerland in February of 1919. Dolan adopted the programme in the hope that Labour delegates to the conference would canvass support for the Republic, and in the belief that the European left would have an influence on the Paris peace talks, which was a conventional idea at the time because you had the Red Scare about communism and so on. You had President Woodrow Wilson talking about peace, without annexations and based on self-determination. So it was believed that the left would have a big influence on the talks. In the event, all the Treaty of Versailles gave to the left was, of course, the International Labour Organization, which is much less, I think, than people expected. Nonetheless, that was really the motivation behind the Democratic Programme. The Rising itself, of course, was very much a product of European politics, as has been alluded to by other speakers. But even some factors which were mentioned, as having a peculiarly, given a sort of peculiarly Irish slant to conservatism, also I think were sort of calibrated by the international situation. Take, for example, anti-communism, which was unusual in Ireland in being so all-pervasive and in being motivated by religion rather than politics. But at the same time, there was very little anti-communism in the 1920s. Why? Because the Vatican looked on the Bolshevik Revolution as a big opportunity. They thought the Bolsheviks would get rid of the Russian Orthodox Church, economic problems will take care of the Bolsheviks, and then we can move in and we can proselytize or evangelize, whatever you want to call it, in Russia. So it was only when Stalin denounced religion as petty bourgeois deviationism in 1929 as part of the mobilization for the 5-year plan that the Pope gave the green light to the bishops to attack communism. And then it's really from that point that you get the Catholic clergy in Ireland attacking communism from 1930 right up to the early 1960s. The second main point I'd like to make concerns the importance of what historians call agency. That is to say, the ability of people, events, institutions to influence history. The point is much often made by A.P. Thompson, author of The Making of the English Working Class, perhaps the most famous book on labour history in the English language. And he liked to point out that the English working class was present at its own making. In other words, Irish radicalism wasn't simply the victim of those three villains of socialist demonology, the priest, the peasant, and the patriot. It was also the victim of its own mistakes. And if I were asked to explain the weakness of radicalism in 20th century Ireland in as few words as possible, I would say Fianna Fáil. They took the ground that should have gone to the Labour Party. But why didn't the Labour Party take that ground? There was no reason why it couldn't have done it, except I think that it had a particularly unfortunate leadership in the 1920s. Why is it that the industrial side of the labour movement was relatively successful in overcoming the challenges of chronic unemployment, immigration, dependence on foreign private investment, etc. And yet, by contrast, the political side was so relatively unsuccessful. The third point I would like to make is that the critics of the state and its failings have underestimated the paradox of national revolution and the problems of economic dependency on Britain. Roy Foster did I think, refer to the problems of dependency. By the paradox of national revolution, I mean that it was much easier to mobilize people against a regime that was seen as alien and really didn't have much legitimacy. I mean, as late as 1912, John Redmond argued that the Irish would be perfectly entitled to rise up in revolt against British rule. Of course, he went on to argue that was now quite unnecessary because we're all going to get home rule, etc., etc. But I mean, it seems to me that this is a fundamental reason why the 1916 Rising was successful, that the state had such little legitimacy. So it was relatively easy for a fairly small and unrepresentative group of people at the time to challenge it. But once the native government was in place, it was much more difficult. So, I mean, all of the IRA campaigns since 1921 have been a failure. Why? The problem of legitimacy of the Dublin regime and indeed the Northern Ireland regimes. And then, of course, there was a problem of economic dependency. In 1924, 98% of exports went to the UK, and 60% of these were that great cliche of Irish underdevelopment, live cattle on the hoof. So dealing with these problems were much more difficult than people had imagined. As Sean Lemass would say in the 1960s, the revolutionaries of his generation had completely underestimated the economic problems that they would face. They found it a lot easier to achieve political independence than economic independence. And of course, as Roy Foster's pointed out, Ireland finally did reduce dependency on Britain only through creating new dependencies on foreign private investment and on the European Union. So I will leave you with those three thoughts, all of them inspired to some degree or other by Karl Marx. Remember that Karl Marx knew a lot about capitalism. Unfortunately, he didn't know very much about socialism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emmet. And our final speaker in the panel is Professor Graham Walker of Queen's University Belfast, who I suspect will deal with another ism, unionism.
Thank you. I was once introduced mistakenly at a conference as a Galwegian instead of a Glaswegian, so I feel that I have some honorary local status. My remarks will mainly concern the relationship of Ulster Protestant Unionists to the theme of the 1916 Easter Rising and to the people that are the focus of Roy Foster's recent book, Vivid Faces, and have featured, of course, in his address this evening. In the preface to his book, Roy states that the mature revolution was far more monocultural and more ethnically defined than the pre-revolution. It might be said that the Ulster Protestant mindset had for decades been attuned to the possibility of the mature revolution. They anticipated it in their assessment of the character of Irish nationalism as irreducibly separatist and Catholic and other. Shortly after the Rising, a prominent Ulster Unionist, William Crawford, referred to it as the work of the extreme section of the Home Rulers. Ulster Protestant preconceptions precluded serious consideration of the pre-revolution. They fixated upon bodies like the Ancient Order of Hibernians, the AOH, and they were oblivious to currents of secular nationalist thought. They paid little attention to the actual bitter feuding between the AOH and advanced nationalists. And in the passing, the question might be asked about how Hibernianism and republicanism reached a rapprochement after the Rising. To what extent was the triumph of the faith and fatherland spirit connected to this? Protestant Ulster thought in binary and survivalist terms. They reduced the national question to a straightforward zero-sum struggle in which religion towered over everything else. It's revealing that something as critical to Northern Protestants as the Ne Temere decree issued by the Catholic Church in 1908 seems barely to have registered among the radicals and the advanced nationalists of Roy Foster's study. The Catholicisation of the post-Rising period, as stressed this evening, only confirmed them in their existing assumptions. This was the lethal fusion of religion and nationalism, of which Conor Cruise O'Brien famously later wrote. The generational clash that Roy highlights was not such a significant theme in the Ulster Protestant world. Nonetheless, there were similarities around the prevalence of energetic and youthful networks and heightened emotional anticipation of defining events to come. There was a similar sense of adventure, exhilaration, fun, and even romance. They too inhabited what Roy describes in relation to his radicals as an enclosed, self-referencing, hectic world. In a book published in 1920 that would seem to have predated the publication of Yeats's Easter 1916 poem, a leading Ulster Unionist figure, Hugh Morrison, who was later to be an MP in the Northern Parliament, referred to the beaming faces of the people involved in the Larne gun running in 1914. The fear of cultural absorption, or indeed, as it's been remarked, enslavement by England, that motivated the radical nationalists and the sense of urgency they felt about preventing it, was paralleled among the Ulster Protestants by fear of being cut off from Britain, especially, it may be said, Scotland, and absorbed by the rest of Ireland in a way that would be culturally, politically, and economically ruinous, and would above all subject them to Catholic dominance of all kinds. For Ulster Presbyterians in particular, the dread with which they viewed a potential Catholic ascendancy was all the more powerful for having experienced an Anglican one. And it was Ulster Presbyterians who were to the fore in objecting to the 1908 Universities Act that President Brown mentioned in his opening remarks this afternoon. The advanced nationalists gearing up for some kind of cathartic confrontation were matched by those in Ulster who were behaving and thinking not dissimilarly. Both thought in terms of preserving the honour and saving the souls of their imagined communities and homelands. Incidentally, the Irish nationalist preoccupation with England as the cultural threat reflected a disdainful perception of Scotland as having been culturally tamed and effectively neutered. Something of this pejorative viewpoint was indeed recycled in Irish reactions to the Scottish independence referendum outcome in 2014. And in both cases, there was a failure to appreciate that Scottish influences and cultural reference points meant and continue to mean much to Ulster Protestants. I hope we can keep Scotland on our minds at this conference and consider how Scotland complicates relationships and perhaps provides clues to both historical and contemporary political and cultural conundrums. You might remember that the British government was preoccupied with trouble in Scotland at the time of the Easter Rising. This past year of commemoration appears to have revealed a cultural impulse to remake and renew in the spirit of the revolutionary generation. It's perhaps then pertinent to ask if the vision this time is more genuinely inclusive than it was in 1916. Does it respect Northern Unionist identity for what it is, rather than claim it for what it desires it to conform to? From another angle, it's much less credible now for Northern Protestants to highlight the factor of Catholic Church power and influence. Has the Church's decline in fact led Northern Protestants, at least quietly, to reassess their relationship to the rest of the island? Scotland's political transformation and its own mood of idealism, especially among the young, might open up new possibilities for Irish-Scottish or Irish-Ulster-Scottish interaction. Although the potential of changes in Scotland to reinforce defensive mindsets needs also to be borne in mind, particularly when certain nationalists in Scotland appear to be 1916 wannabes. While discussion and debate over the significance of 1916 in Ireland has been impressively nuanced and expansive, some pro-independence groups and political figures and some academics in Scotland have crudely attached an old-fashioned celebration of it to their brand of identity politics. In some circles in contemporary Scotland, it seems as if the revisionist controversies over the practice and use of history that so preoccupied Ireland once upon a time not so long ago never actually took place. Some concluding remarks about Brexit. I think the most urgent question is whether it's upset the honours-even aspect of the Good Friday Agreement with deleterious consequences for peace and stability. Brexit, moreover, has called into question notions of British tolerance and the capacity of Britishness and the Union to accommodate diversity. This has serious implications for the civic unionist line of argument based on concepts of pluralism and flexibility. It puts unionists in Scotland in a difficult position. The best pro-union arguments in 2014 derived from this perspective, and it further weakens moderate unionism relative to hardline ethnic unionism in Northern Ireland. A final thought concerns an aspect of the Good Friday Agreement, a rather low-key feature of that agreement up until now, namely the British-Irish Council, which now has its secretariat in Scotland. Could this body raise its profile at last and have a meaningful role to play in the present crisis? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Graham. You really broadened the menu of topics even further than I thought was possible. I'm going to give Roy Foster an opportunity to reply to some of these comments. This is not in defensive fashion, but I'm sure it has prompted a number of observations on your part, Roy. So I'll give you the floor.
I'll be brief because you've heard enough from me. But I'm very flattered to receive these comments, and I agree with very many of them. I'm going to go through them in the order in which they were offered, just making some points. And Dolan, and I loved your phrase of the lyrically discontented, expressed with a certain fine disdain. but the lyricism and eloquence of your own paper was brilliant and concealed, I think, large areas of agreement, as a good barrister would always manage to do. I think that I did stress the stability and the admirable stability and the desirable outcomes of the stability of the post-revolutionary state, as well as the disillusionment that several people felt about it. I will admit, and I have had to admit this on several occasions, that my preoccupation when I've written about this has necessarily been often with the middle class and the articulate, because that's where I was going for their records. And I absolutely agree with you that those who got on with their lives in circumstances of great difficulty are to be admired and recorded, if only we could record them in such detail. I don't quite accept the implication of anachronism, because I kept arguing against it in my paper, what Anne calls the outrageous presumption to hold the past to account. I did try not to. But many people at the time expressed the kind of dissatisfaction with the ideals of 1916. The correspondence of so many of what I call my old revolutionaries did testify to this. I'm very glad you mentioned Patrick Lynch's essay, an essay I still admire, and I suspect we both do, because at the time it was a powerful intervention. I agree, and I did make this point myself, that the land revolution and the political revolution came in different phases, and I'm with John Marcus O'Sullivan that that was a good thing, because I would rather see the Irish landlords expropriated by legislation underwritten by the British taxpayer than hung from their oaks in their parks, as would have happened and did happen in Russia. This is not because I really like landlords. It's because I don't like seeing people hung from trees. You do raise the question of the unrepresentativeness, Anne, of the signatories of their proclamation, and the fact that perhaps they would better have lived than died for Ireland. I wouldn't dare to say so much, and I congratulate you for saying it. Moving on to Tony's remarks, which fascinated me, and I think, Tony, you've no need to apologise for not being an Irish historian, because you, as Graham has just done, opened out the thing in a terrifically interesting way. Yes, those global moments and European parallels were very much in my mind, as they were when I was writing about generations and thinking of Spanish and German generations as well, and indeed invoking them. And I think Michael Mann, who's someone I've learned a great deal from, and the idea of waves of revolution is also very relevant. Young Turks, Mexicans, Chinese happening at the same time. I think one might also mention the Balkan Wars as exactly contemporaneous and full of relevance for Ireland. I do agree that 1916 can be both an attempted putsch and part of 1912 to 22 process, though the precipitative effect of the Great War can never be downwritten. I also think, incidentally, we might think of the 1905 Russian Revolution as being so very parallel to much of the impetus that's firing the radical revolutionaries in Ireland at the time, and many of them come from very, very similar backgrounds. I would slightly query the question that radicalism on a mobilizing, demonstrative basis doesn't really hit Ireland till after 1916. It's certainly there in 1912, 1913, 1914. The volunteering movements, which seem to me one of the great unexplored phenomena of Irish history, represent this. So, of course, does the labour unrest of 1913. The volunteering movement, in a sense, I think, undercuts and diverts the energy from what could have been other forms of social demonstration, but it's happening before, and here again the advent of the war is incredibly important. I could talk for much longer about the idea of counter-revolution, which has been, the phrase has been applied to the 1920s, I think in an over-exaggerated form by at least one scholar, but the parallels you brought up in Europe were fascinating, and I'd love to talk to you more about them. You spoke finally of the 1920s, counter-revolution. One reason I think why things didn't become a sort of European-style counter-revolution in Ireland is, and we'll come to this again, I'm sure, the simple fact of Fianna Fáil. I think when De Valera brings Fianna Fáil back into the constitutional system, it undercuts what could have turned, very possibly, into a one-party state, and is one reason why Franco's Spain and Salazar's Portugal aren't in some ways too parallel to Ireland. Thank God for our history. Finally, it's very interesting. Maurice Manning also spoke of what we'll do when the Civil War has to be commemorated, certainly not celebrated, in a few years' time. And I hope, in the spirit of Tony McGarrigle's intervention, that we can then think of Spanish and of Greek and of Finnish parallels and open out that discussion too. Riona, yes, I agree completely. I was acutely conscious that I was ignoring cultural revivalism, partly because I've looked at it in my book, and I didn't want to repeat myself. But I think what you say recalls a lot of the work of Sinead Garrigan-Matter, of Tim McMahon, as well as of Philip O'Leary on this vital question. And I think one way in which, again, I would involve this idea of disillusionment and promise is that for so many marginalized, or people who felt they were marginalized, Irish Protestants from North and South, Irish speaking was a way of authentication and a way of feeling their way into a new identity. It's very true, I think, of Bulmer Hobson, of Ernest Blythe. It's true of Cheska Trench. It's true of Rosalind Jacob. It's true of many of the people who recorded how they transformed themselves and transformed their relation to their country through speaking Irish. I think they were disappointed by, as Flann O'Brien constantly mocked, the way that what he called civil service Irish took over what had been an enabling and enthusing cultural moment. And I also think, and we heard about education earlier in the day, that the methods and the approaches of teaching compulsory Irish, as in my school days, were a profound mistake, and I would say a betrayal of the ideals of the cultural revolution that is part of the political revolution. The way recently the changes in the approach to teaching Irish is, I think, an enormously good thing. But I think that the approach of the state to the imposition of learning Irish was part of the structures that led to the kind of revolutionary disillusionment about which I've been lecturing recently and which I still defend as an important concept and process. Emmet's comments on the European context, indeed the world context of Irish labour history are, I think, fundamentally important, as was his point that from the 18th century Ireland is, as I was indicating in another way, in the mainstream of European history. In fact, with Nicholas Canny here, I'm sure he won't disagree, from 1590 to 1690, Ireland is at the absolute matrix of enormous events in European history as well, and we should not forget that. The Yeats paradigm of political energy transferring into cultural energy is something I myself have great problems with and have written critically of on various occasions. I am prepared on certain points to criticize W.B. Yeats. I'm sorry, I'm reading my own scribbles here, and they're not very. Yeah, I was fascinated by Emmet's comment that anti-communism only becomes prominent in Catholic, especially, I guess, Episcopal rhetoric from the 1930s. This has jolted me, and I'm going to go back and think about it, and I hope talk to you about that later on. It's a very interesting comment, as is the background you gave to it. Once again, we reach the vital importance of Fianna Fáil, in this case, stealing the clothes of labour issues, and that's very, very important. The legitimacy of the state made the illegitimacy, the limited notion of the state as legitimate, making 1916 successful. I would slightly query some of that. Desmond Fitzgerald's letters and diaries are very vivid, and others too, that when 1914 happens, and to the horror of radical nationalists, everyone joins up and goes off to fight the war. Desmond Fitzgerald thought this meant the end of a viable independence for Ireland. He thought that the Irish people were voting with their feet to legitimise British rule and the British Empire, and from that point he thought there would probably have to be a noble and futile gesture. I think 1916 comes as much out of that as a recognition that the state is illegitimate. At the same time, Emmet, I'm partly with you in that I think the pusillanimous response of the Liberal government towards the Ulster resistance did destroy the legitimacy of the state in the eyes of many legally minded nationalists. Kevin O'Sheill's autobiography is very clear about this, so there certainly is something there. Finally, Graham, that was a very corrective and incisive and, I thought, marvellous way of making us look across the channel to Scotland as well, but also of, as you've often done, inhabiting or clarifying the mindset of the Ulster Unionists. I like to think of all those vivid-faced young people running out to run guns from Larne and being equivalent to the people I was writing about in the South. I think their impulses and their preoccupations were narrower, but I fully accept that they were having a lot of fun, and that it became, and fun, I think, fun in Irish history that's a concept which I think we should think a lot more of. But I do think that they were enabled, energized, created together in that UVF moment, in a way that Frank McGuinness's wonderful play, Observe the Sons of Ulster, marvellously reimagined. The Scots dimension is there, and we forget it too readily. There was a moment, if we're talking about moments in the very early 20th century, when the idea of a pan-Celtic revival involving Scotland, Brittany, Cornwall, as well as Ireland, suddenly bubbles up, and there are, great Celtic racial congresses and so forth. It bubbles away again pretty damn fast. And there are a number of reasons, I think, that I haven't time to go into to consider why this was so. But on that point, I'd like to end, because Paul Bew long ago warned us against writing partitionist history and dealing with Irish experience as if it is divided into a 26-county and 6-county area from a point of time long before 1920. I couldn't agree with him more. And I think that we should attempt to cover the waterfront or the island from north to south as well as from east to west, especially when we are writing about it before actual partition happens in 1920. This is not to say that there is not a very different sense of experience, of life, of history, of culture in the northeast and the rest of the island. You cannot say otherwise. But at that moment, at that pre-revolutionary and revolutionary moment, there are people who very much believe in transcending that. And I mentioned Ernest Blythe. You could also mention Pat McCartan, Dennis McCullough, Alice Milligan, Bulmer Hobson again. And they do form a northern cultural revivalist, nationalist phalanx, which imparts a very important element into what is happening in the rest of the island. All of them, except I think of the ones I've listed, Alice Milligan, go south and stay south. And perhaps that's one of the tragedies of Irish history, and also one of the reasons why we are impelled sometimes to write partitionist history. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. That was marvellous. We have about 10 minutes for questions. I'm going to take them in groups. I don't want any speeches, please. So if you could have a short question, I'll take about 3 questions, then feed it back to the panel, and then we'll see what time does after that. So short questions, please. Hands up. Anybody who's I can't really see. I can't really see. There's one over here. So we'll take.
as a non-historian, what was the Vatican's response, if any, to the 1916 Rising? Does anybody know?
Oh, they were. And who wants to take that? I mean, they were against it, and the British actually contacted the Vatican to try and come in and express their views.
I think Joseph Plunkett
His father took. Count Plunkett had given some advanced notice to the Vatican as to what was happening, but the Vatican itself were not sympathetic. There's interesting stuff actually on the Irish. Dermot Keogh, I think, did it on the Irish community in Rome, which is a large Catholic community. The Christian Brothers were particularly Anglophile in their views afterwards. There were various rebellious spirits to be found among the Franciscans, Augustinians, Dominicans and others, but the Christian Brothers emerge as the most pro-British at the time, which is an interesting twist on what happened, on how we perceive things. It shows you your stereotypes should always be challenged. Yes, okay.
To all the panellists, arising from the entire commemorations, what do you see as the biggest gaps in research at the moment, the most urgent questions still to be answered?
Okay. Who wants to start with that? Anne, will you?
I think in a way it's to try and maybe echo the point Roy just made. I mean, I think a lot of the time we assume everyone is obsessed with the political events as we are looking back, or we impose, if you like, a chronology looking back, that I think to some degree the ordinary experience, the day-to-day life, if you like, almost that sense of, yes, someone tried to write a history of fun in Ireland. So, I do a second-year lecture course about Ireland in the 20th century, and out of badness, at the very last lecture is on happiness in the 20th century. Is it possible to give a 50-minute lecture on happiness in 20th century Ireland? I mean, I think that should just try again to build on a lot of the work that's been done during this centenary period, which has been incredibly valuable about finding a whole diverse range of experiences, and to just expand upon that and to bring that into the rest of the century, really. Yeah.
Anybody else want to come in on that?
I think from my perspective, and I mentioned it there on both sides, I think it's important to remind ourselves that the society at that stage was much more bilingual than maybe it is now, in the sense that in 1901, 14% of the population returned themselves as Irish speakers, and 0.5% of them were monoglot Irish speakers. And I see it in literary history as well. We tend to look at them, and there's guilt on both sides. We look through the lens of Irish or through the lens of English, and we tend to ignore the way it overlapped. No society, ideas, languages intermingle. That's the nature of languages. And I think combining some of the fantastic research in both languages would give us a much richer and a much diverse and a greater understanding of the nuances of the time.
Yeah, I'm just to add to that, we still don't have a definitive study of what and when and why public opinion changed after the Rising. Was it the arrests, was it the executions, and so on. And we need also, I think, more research on the response in provincial Ireland.
Could I just throw in the point I made about the AOH? This is an organisation with 230,000 members around 1914. I know a lot of them are there for the insurance purposes and so on, but nevertheless, what happened to the AOH?
That was something I'd meant to say in response to you, Graham, that it is the way that the AOH and their traditional arch enemies in the IRB and indeed Sinn Féin become friends is something that has never been explored. Also, I'd like to repeat something I said a few minutes ago, that the volunteering movement, which the more I look at this period, is vitally important, and Tony would agree that it's paralleled movements all over Europe, but we don't have the vast, huge history of the volunteers that we should have, nor do we have, though this is the fault of the sources, the very large-scale exploratory study of the thought and life of Arthur Griffith that we should have, whose influence is remarkable, who is an extraordinary thinker and man in many ways. There is a good recent biography by Brian May, but we need something incredibly probing about this, because there is a sense in which the ideas, and I was thinking about this again this afternoon, that Griffith's ideas of freedom, his belief that the Renunciation Act of 1783 made British government illegitimate in Ireland, his as a creative political thinker, as well as a mosquito journalist, much more than as a mosquito journalist, he has never quite received his due.
I would only add, of course, that I think there is a need now, and historians are moving to that. Conor Mulvey, who was here this morning, maybe he's still here now, is one of this younger generation of historians here in Ireland who are putting who are taking Ireland, the Irishness out of the Irish Rising and out of what happens later, and putting it into that larger European and transnational context. And I think until that's done, we can't really understand properly what's happening in Ireland unless we see it as part of this larger global phenomenon that we call revolution and change, calls for constitutional nationalism and so on, in the context of the dissolution of empires and the emergence of nations.
There's a hand there. I'll take that last question. Just wait. Could you wait a sec? Thank you.
I'm president of the Irish and Fenian Republican Brotherhood. Which requires
you spoke earlier today. This is a very crowded
to
session.
research the Irish and Fenian Republican Brotherhood.
Okay. Thank
And
you.
all right,
Thank
Roy
you.
said there was an elephant in the room. There's 3 elephants there. The tricolour flag, which is the Irish Republican Brothers, they put it up. Our sovereign seat at Dolan and our proclamation.
You had an opportunity to speak earlier today. There's a lot. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Fine. Okay. Excuse me. We have listened to you earlier today. At this point, we have to conclude this session because there is another fringe session starting here in about 10 minutes' time, and they need us to vacate the room. So before I finish, I have one piece of housekeeping I have a housekeeping announcement to make, which is that Minister Humphrey's session tomorrow morning starts at 9:30. It's on the programme, I think, is it for 9, but so we have 30 minutes grace in the morning. So I look forward to seeing you there tomorrow at 9:30. But before we finish, I want to begin by thanking, first of all, the Taoiseach for his really important remarks here this evening, and we really appreciate those of us who come from the humanities community really appreciate what you said. We will hold you to account, I'm afraid, for them, Taoiseach. I want to also thank our wonderful speaker, Roy Foster, and our 5 panellists for such a diverse and rich debate. So thank you very much. We can continue it.